And if I may, I'd like to quote one of my favourite poets, Percy Bysshe Shelley. The line I like the best is this one. Rise like lions after slumber, in unvanquishable number. Shake your chains to earth like dew, which in sleep had fallen on you. Ye are many, they are few. I quote Shelley because he inspired like so many others do. I'm proud to be at Glastonbury because it inspires so many to music festivals all over the country. Let us be together and recognise another world is possible if we come together to understand that, understand the power we've got and achieve that decent, better society where everyone matters. Thank you for inviting me here today. I'm proud to be here. Thank you very much, Glastonbury.
Hey, welcome to The Future is a Mixtape. I'm Matt.
I'm Jesse.
And we're going to be breaking down a wild session on British politics, Labour, Corbyn, Theresa May, manifestos. And we'll be joined by our friends Joshua Bregman, who's going to be calling in remote from Santa Fe, and our friend Alex Biancardi, who's a British citizen.
Yeah, so this is a lot of fun. There's a lot of stuff to get to in this one, and we don't tackle it all, but we are going to end with some Jeremy Corbyn chants.
Such a feeling.
That's not it.
But something like that. Remember, the Jeremy Corbyn is a reference to Seven Nation Army, right?
Along with that tune. So enjoy.
I'm just like really psyched that Corbyn like headlined at Glastonbury pretty much.
Yeah, we just talk about that. Yeah.
That was sick. Like, yeah.
And also just like incredibly exciting and loud.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess they try to find some, maybe The Guardian or some try to find some balanced setting on that. But I mean, for me, this has kind of blown me away this year because I was assuming or hoping that I would be following Bernie Sanders' presidential policies, right? And that didn't happen. And as Naomi Klein said, we were so close that you could actually dream that Bernie Sanders would win.
Right.
But now after the Bernie Sanders primary, essentially I'm following vicariously through British politics because I'm seeing what I wanted from Bernie Sanders and the Bernie Sanders movement.
Right.
And so I've been listening to Novara Radio for about the last year or so, essentially when Corbyn started to coming through at the same time as Bernie was coming through. I was like, oh my God, this dude is actually a democratic socialist. And so he was coming through and I was like, well, wait, if Bernie doesn't work through, at least I have something else to hope for. And so I started listening to Novara Radio with Aaron Bastani and James Butler, who are just wonderful. I just think it's a great podcast. And so I started following British politics about a year ago. Alex, did you?
Well, being British, I followed it for a while, but I think what Corbyn is riding on is the disenfranchisement of young people in Britain, right? Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I mean, essentially, you had followed it when Corbyn got into the Labour Party, but didn't think much of it, the possibility?
I was optimistic. I had many Facebook arguments with Labour moderates that I knew, who were always saying he was unelectable, and that was what all the British media said.
Well, that was also mostly coming tremendously from Liberals. Like, okay, we like him, he's a good guy, but he's not electable. He's not presidential enough.
Right.
that kind of logic was used with Sanders. I mean, when were you following the Corbyn stuff, Josh?
I started following Corbyn right when he made his leadership bid. I think that was 2015. So I moved there in 2011, and then that was right after the student uprising at Millbank. And then shortly after I moved there were the riots. And actually in the neighborhood I was living in, where the riots were in that neighborhood as well. So I went and photographed them. So I'd been following the political situation the entire time I was there. And then I left in 2013, 2014. And then Corbyn came on the scene. I mean, at least ran for the leadership in 2015. So I started following it then. And then I was pretty avidly following it, the entire time through the first coup. And yeah, I mean, it was just a pretty lively discussion and something no one had ever seen before. And it was pretty fascinating, the dynamic of what enabled him to get into the leadership position in the first place, how they had apparently the PLP had lowered the bar for membership, hoping to get a lot of rank and file in that would drown out the union vote. And they were hoping to check the power of the unions within the party.
And the PLP,
The PLP is the Parliamentary Labour Party, so that's the members of parliament who've been elected in their constituencies who are in the party, and they have like different ideology. They run the gamut on an ideological spectrum from right to left within a certain boundary within the party. But generally speaking, they were dominated by what's now considered the right of the party, but back 2 years ago was just considered the norm. So yeah, they had.
Basically, you started following pretty much right when Corbyn was running.
Yeah, and then I learned through following it and reading, and because when I got there, it was Miliband, and he had just lost again to Cameron, and it was and Labour was super bland and going nowhere, so it wasn't really worth.
I
mostly
like the Democratic
what
Party
Cameron
right
was
now.
doing.
Yeah, I mean,
it was more like Kerry.
Jesse, when were you following this?
Oh, I'm probably the last one to the party here, as it were. I hadn't, like most Americans, I wasn't paying attention to what was going on over the pond or on the other side of the pond with any sort of interest above average until this snap election, really. Once, what hits the front pages here in the States are only the one. We only see the centrist, the neoliberal viewpoint, the story typically anyways. So we all knew about Brexit. There wasn't much coverage about Theresa May coming into power. That is just sort of like, it just happened as far as we knew. There wasn't much story here about the drama there. And it wasn't until, it really wasn't until after she had called this snap election to try to, strong arm their way into a greater majority in Parliament that this really became a phenomenon. I think that the Corbyn phenomenon really became something that we all started to look at a little more.
We also thought that he was going to get destroyed, and that this was actually a legitimate attempt on their part to actually just destroy the Labour Party forever, like use the Death Star. This election was designed to be like the Death Star to the Labour Party, and everyone other than Aaron Bastani from Novara Radio really saw no option but to kind of stem the bleeding. And Aaron Bastani from Novara Radio was like, there's actually really a space here. Let's take this accident because it might be an accident, And if you look at the pattern for British politics, it's a series of really wonderful accidents, like lowering the threshold for membership fee, like you're talking about PLP, actually allowing people to afford to become members, which is totally foreign to the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. You can be a member and you pay a membership fee. And then Corbyn running in as just this nice person that's a symbolic vestige of the old Labour Party, and he gets it. And then again and again, Brexit or the snap election, it's these weird accidents where things open up.
I think what the leadership of the Labour Party really underestimated was how angry most Labour voters were with Labour. For me, growing up, my family is a Labour family. We had Tony Blair coming in 1997 with incredible amount of optimism behind him, and then he pretty much became George Bush's second in command. Led us into two wars that were wildly unpopular, and then at the end of his prime ministership, there was the Great Recession, right? So British Labour voters this was supposed to be like, let's compromise by going towards the centre so that we can take power with Tony Blair. Okay, we'll sell our souls for that to get into power. It turns out that was a total failure for them. They were really pissed off at that. Then we had Miliband, who was another centrist, who we gave a chance, and he didn't win the election. So we thought, you know what? If we can't win with the centrists, let's just try and stick with our values. Like, let's go back to what we actually believe in, because we can't win with the centrists. So we just gave it a shot. I think that was the mood. But we were really angry with the mainstream Labour Party and the Blairites, as we all call them.
And it's working so far, right? We're seeing unprecedented sort of response to a politician who's apparently not trying to pull the wool over anyone's eyes. That's just a normal human being and trying to put forth and trying, he wasn't even pursuing power, right? It was like, oh, he's the next in line. 2015 when we put him up for the leadership position, it was like, it was like, oh, yeah, I guess so. I'll do it. And I think it's just incredible seeing the response when you actually have a program about real ideas. It's not just this fucking bullshit of trying to play tricks on everybody.
Right.
Yeah, I think there's definitely, I think that's kind of a remarkable thing about the Corbyn and the Sanders phenomenon. I mean, they were both sort of accidental, reluctant, like Cincinnatus types, didn't exactly intend to, it wasn't their lifelong ambition to be in this spot. And I think what's kind of refreshing for a lot of people and also kind of astonishing is that I think in a way, like they're sort of, plain like kind of naivete about the process in a way is it's sort of like what we're taught in like civics 101 in high school, is that like you have an idea about what you want to do and how you want the country to be better, and you run and you tell people what your idea is, and they either like it or they don't, and they give the thumb up or the thumbs down, and then when you vote it in, you do those things, and it like in my, that's sort of what I learned as a child. And then, as you get more sophisticated, you learn, you're supposed to think of it as a different kind of game where there's like, the public message and the private message and branding and messaging and marketing and all of what's our, all of the sort of strategies of like public manipulation. And I think, back to what Alex was saying, I think at some level, it's not just like all the betrayals, but I think there's just like a sort of fatigue with all of that. I think average people, really see through it, and they understand they're being manipulated, even if you do hear a lot of them saying a lot of these sort of, repeating a lot of these sort of vapid observations that you hear in the media. So having someone come along and do the thing that we were all brought up to think politicians are supposed to do, and I think like most of the grassroots is sort of responding to that and saying, well, yeah, that's exactly what I thought politics was about. And then the sort of sophisticated technocratic political class is being like, this is impossibly naive. It can never work. But this guy has clearly not enough degrees and hasn't spent enough time talking to the right people about how this isn't how it's done, Yeah, I think there's definitely that phenomenon going on as well.
Yeah, and I think for me, one of the best pieces that I've read recently that gave context to this phenomenon was actually a piece called Despair Fatigue by David Graeber in Baffler magazine. It was really great. It was written a year ago or so, but pulled it up again recently because it just gave a great description of exactly what you're talking about.
What I think also too is like we've lived in the neoliberal age. I'm 41, so we've lived in the neoliberal age for my entire life, basically. I mean, if you actually trace it back to stagflation and Jimmy Carter, it goes earlier than Thatcher. But, you look around and you're like, well, these are the people that actually have been saying the same things for a long time, and everyone else we don't believe in. And here's Jeremy Corbyn, here's Bernie Sanders, and they've actually said the same thing for a long time. And we maybe can talk about the limits of satire and Daily Show, but maybe that sense of being inured by the bullshit allowed us to move past peak liberalism, where it's all about representation and posturing and image, to just the fucking realness of the people themselves. Like, Corbyn seems like a human being, like, and he does small talk better than Bernie Sanders. Like when he was on, I don't know, it wasn't Question Time, but he's like offered the guest his fucking jam from his fucking farm I mean, how real is that? I mean,
Yeah.
Like a politician offers you jam on television. I mean, and that's the kind of thing is this general realness about the people, and that they've had policies and views that are consistent. And I saw, a YouTube clip that popped up last week that showed Jeremy Corbyn saying the same things about war, about governance, about ethics, about healthcare and welfare state for 30 plus years. And that's the same thing we were seeing in the Bernie Sanders campaign, were these clips about them saying and being humanly consistent, right? Which is what we, like you said, naively thought politics were supposed to be about, was people that had values and they weren't just, Frank Underwoods.
But it's something we've seen on both sides of the Atlantic, in the sense, I don't mean that Trump is genuinely real, but his supposed realness was one of the main reasons that he was elected, right? Same with back in Britain with Nigel Farage, who was the leader of the UK Independence Party, the main party pushing for Brexit before it happened. He was seen as a kind of relatable guy, even though he was incredibly elite, posh bloke. But people always said, "Oh, he seemed like the kind of guy you'd have a drink with down the pub." And he was often pictured actually smoking and drinking.
This despair fatigue isn't exclusively the right of the left.
No.
We're all all of us, the many, are experiencing this fatigue.
And then finally, somebody who's real on the left is doing well. But we didn't. I think the mainstream parties on the left, including the Democratic Party, for some reason just didn't notice this fact that people were completely sick of fake politicians.
Well, and it's fortuitous because Adam Curtis's new film Hypernormalization talks about the hypernormalization process of Soviet politics, that nobody believed anymore what they were hearing. And while there wasn't an idea of what the future could look like, everyone was going along as if it was real, but it was completely fake, and everyone knew they were being lied to. Right. And that's Brian Eno's talked about that too, which is the difference between Soviet propaganda and American propaganda in media, is that, in the Soviet era, people knew they were being lied to. That's why families get drunk on vodka in the fucking park. And why Gorbachev would try to control vodka because people were trying to kill themselves. And here, the inuredness, the sense of deadness, is now being seen in neoliberalism.
So I think it might be worthwhile to just do a little brief sort of breakdown. How do we get to this point? What were the steps leading up to what we're looking at and talking about now? And how did we get to Brexit, to the snap election, and how did that coincide with Corbyn's rise and what's happening now?
So did you want me to go over some of the basics about how the UK parliamentary system works?
Sure.
Okay,
we'll do that.
So I'd say that the main difference is that the executive and the legislative branches are fused. So in plain English, the president in the US system, they're not in Congress. They're not the leader. They're not the head of the Democrats in Congress. Whereas
separate branch,
right?
Yeah.
Whereas in Britain, the head of the Labour Party in the House of Commons is the Prime Minister. Well, the head of the biggest party in the House. Hopefully, I'm getting ahead of myself there. I'm getting ahead of myself with the prospect of Prime Minister Corbyn. But
utopian slip.
Utopian slip.
The head of the biggest party in the House of Commons in Parliament, which is the equivalent of the House of Representatives, is the Prime Minister.
Yeah.
And to become the Prime Minister, you just have to become the biggest party in the House of Commons, which is like the biggest party in the House of Representatives. So there is no separate election for our equivalent of Congress.
You don't elect the Prime Minister.
No, you don't elect the Prime Minister, right? You have to elect essentially members of Congress, but members of Parliament, the House of Commons in particular. MPs, right? Yeah. And the party with the most becomes the one that governs, and their leader is the Prime Minister.
There's 650 seats, so they just need...
It's 326. Yeah. So that is the biggest difference. I mean, there's all kinds of other things that are quite unusual for someone who's coming from this side of the pond. So there's the House of Lords, which is our equivalent of the Senate, which is completely unelected. So it's just selected by the parties in the House of Commons.
Yeah.
So this is the one that wears all these
selected by God.
Yes,
Lords.
Not anymore. Actually, they took. There used to be a lot of them were just religious figures who were, I guess, selected by God.
Yeah.
But nowadays they have to be appointed from within the House of Commons, and they're the ones who wear all these magical wizard robes, basically.
Right.
So that's a bit of an old-fashioned thing. So there's that. But yeah, so I think those are the main. I mean, not having a constitution is the other thing that you mentioned earlier.
How much power do that folks in the House of Lords have? Because I thought sometimes it was connected to title. Obviously it passed generationally between titles. Like
they abolished hereditary lords titles, I believe, in the mid 2000s. They abolished the hereditary peers who could just become a lord because their father was, right.
How much power do they have in terms of shutting down the Commons? Is it morally symbolic?
I think not the same amount that the Senate does. Mm-hmm. It's comparable to that because bills have to pass both houses essentially. But I think it's easier for the Commons to override the Lords. But they do sometimes crop up and do something good. There were several times in the 2000s I know that they shut down anti-terror legislation that would have been invasion of privacy. So they're quite like liberal old lords a lot of the time in the classical sense of liberalism. But obviously they're not a progressive force. These are the unelected posh people.
Conversely, I think there's someone in the House of Lords that was trying to chip away at NHS, the health service, by privatizing it slowly, and they have investments in the privatization of NHS. So there's also more conservative elements too.
Right.
Okay, there's the framework in which the mechanisms happen, but how do we get to here? How do we get to a place where Jeremy Corbyn and the radical left, as it were, of the Labour Party had the opportunity even to voice their views?
Well, so one of the key steps was mentioned before, where Ed Miliband changed the system of voting for the leader of the Labour Party when he was the head of the Labour Party to let regular members vote. Right.
Democratized it.
Right, they democratized it. It's obviously horribly backfired for them. But
under the assumption that it would work in his favor.
Yeah,
right.
That it would moderate the power of the unions who were further left than the parliamentary Labour Party. Yeah. So yeah, this did backfire. So that was an enabling.
That's interesting because it's the same thing that's happening to Theresa May. It's like let's have the people vote on this because there's an assumption that they're going to just be able to consolidate power.
Exactly. Yeah. So that it wouldn't have happened without that. But I'd say I think my generation is very important to this because it turned out in this general election.
Yeah, you young folks.
Us young folks voted very, very strongly for Corbyn. So what have we experienced? Well, I was born in 1990. The first politics I was aware of was Tony Blair winning, and then us going into Iraq and Afghanistan with George W. Bush. But later on, Tony Blair also introduced tuition fees for universities. Yep. Universities used to be free in the UK, right? Uh-huh. He introduced tuition fees. While I was in university, tuition fees tripled.
Well, don't you want to be like America? Come on. That's what you got to do to be like America.
I mean, it works so well over here. Yeah. But so they're all public universities still, by the way. Private universities are pretty much unheard of. But this is all private universities going from being free to being £9,000 a year.
Yep.
So all students universally were enraged by this. Nick Clegg in particular was a target because he was a Liberal Democrat in coalition with the Conservatives when that was passed, the tripling of tuition fees, and he campaigned against it. But anyway, so there was that. The financial crisis was going on at the time, so that when we graduated, we didn't have any job prospects.
I think can I jump in just real quick?
Yeah.
I think it's really important to note here that these things weren't grandfathered in. So literally you had students who were finishing up their year and then in the middle of their degrees expected to come up with £9,000 if they wanted to keep going on their degree in the fall after May.
Right.
And families that had, students that were going into university, no one had saved for this. It wasn't like anyone that was on the horizon. So, a lot of people were getting out of their secondary school and expecting to go to university with what they had. And then all of a sudden it's like, boom, £9,000, which, if you haven't saved for it, it's kind of hard to come up with on the fly. So for most folks,
were you going to school over there at that time?
Well, I got caught up in the immigration thing, which was a whole separate ball of wax, but they did the same thing with that. They decided overnight that they were going to cut immigration by revoking student visas. They had what they call as a post-study visa. You could stay after school and work. And they didn't grandfather anyone in. So literally I was in the middle of my school program and the visa that I was hoping to get when I left my program just disappeared. So that meant that I just had to go home after my school program was over, which meant that all the networking and the contacts I built up in school and all of that professional work that I had done to set myself up after school had just was gone, you know. So I had to leave, but it wasn't so much. Thousands of people got caught up in this. And also the university system largely relies on foreign students pay full freight. So it's a big stream of revenue for them.
And what year was this?
That was 2011. It went into, that was Cameron and Clegg. Yeah. So overnight, the university system just had hundreds of millions of pounds hoovered out of it.
Because and students went out and protested this, right?
And they took over conservative headquarters. It was pretty Occupy-like, very riotous. It was before Occupy, I think.
I think so. Like, this was like my first political experience, pretty much, right? So I was in university doing my undergraduate at University of Warwick, which is a historically left-wing campus. But the student fee issue was coming in 2011. We just set up our own branch of Occupy on campus. Student fees for us was one of the main issues. But there were these protests in London, which were massive protests, in which it was getting quite rowdy. You know, I think there was a famous thing that I heard. A French journalist said that finally the English have woken up from their slumber, because they're the ones who are used to protesting in this big way, and English people don't really, generally, not as much as the French, but they were shocked to see that, you know, there were now the black blocs smashing up banks in these protests and taking over Conservative HQ.
And all the while we're sitting over here, we're wondering when are Americans going to awake from their slumber.
Right.
That's the thing is these, you know, and David Harvey talks about this too, is that movements are often global and they often start from cities. If you read his book, Rebel Cities, it's kind of the idea that these cities are contagions where anger and rage build up and then they hop to another city. And so it's important to remember that folks that occupied Wisconsin during Walker's attempt to kind of take away bargaining rights for union teachers happened in response of seeing Arab Spring. So Arab Spring happened, and then you had people from Arab Spring in Egypt, especially Egypt, during the Cairo protests, they were ordering pizza for Wisconsin workers. And then Wisconsin people were ordering food for people in Cairo. And so there's this tremendous sense of, you know, transnational solidarity in these movements. And many students in the U.S. were also inspired by the protests in London and seeing young people out.
Yeah, I think also it's important to sort of make a note of, I mean, this has happened transnationally, internationally, but like just how out of touch and sclerotic the British elites were, especially in the instance of student fees. I mean, what had happened was David Cameron had been elected in the last election, and he didn't form a majority with his government, so he had to go into coalition. He went into coalition with the Lib Dems. The leader of the Lib Dems is a guy named Nick Clegg. Clegg swore up and down on a stack of Bibles that he was not going to raise student fees. Got into power, and literally 30 days later, raised tuition fees.
Motherfucker.
I mean, and like, so it's
and
like...
that motherfucker is gone now. He just lost.
He's gone. He's ice. But I mean, you can't, I mean, it's like the extent of the reversal and the betrayal and like the cynicism is so breathtaking and it's so brazen. Like they're not even, I don't think he even offered like any kind of apologetic or rationale. It was just like, no, you know, we took your vote and you're screwed now. Like, and so the rage was like really intense. And I think, and again, it's just like a recurring theme in British politics, you know, just like, they don't see these things coming, you know, because and they're so isolated and they're so in these like self-reflexive echo chambers. They think this is just fine.
We could say it's the system, but it's also just notions of power. There's a recent article from Atlantic that I'll post in the show notes for this podcast that says what happens with power, whether it's monetary or status-based, is the mirror neurons used for empathy get blocked. So you actually like just fucking don't really know what you're doing, because you have an empathy gap. And so these sclerotic kind of controlling, powerful agents of the political apparatus actually don't really know what it's like for people every day. It's called the Washington bubble here. And the power that's so manifest and concentrated, it's like we could say it's the political system. It's also the fact that these people have had power for so long that they actually have no idea how other people feel.
Right. That's interesting. But I should point out as well that an interesting fact about who is in power in Britain during these times is very, very few people were actually elected to be the leaders of this country during this time, because at the end of the 2000s, Tony Blair resigned and Gordon Brown became Prime Minister, so he wasn't elected.
Yep.
Then we had this election in which nobody won and in which the Conservatives and the Lib Dems became a coalition together. So they weren't the biggest party. They had to form this coalition government, in which a coalition of losers, basically. Cameron finally won an election, but then resigned after Brexit. So Theresa May was appointed again.
Yeah.
So we've had almost nobody who's been prime minister in the last few years has been elected to this position.
And so what got us here in end of June 2017 into this hung parliament, in this indeterminate sort of situation, is she assumed, based on the polling, that there's slight majority, because whether they have just barely had a majority in Parliament, right?
Like 10 or something.
Yeah. That if she called an election, which she was advised not to, right? They didn't want her to do it initially, right? As far as I understand. But then the Parliament did vote once she proposed it, they did vote to go forward with an election. But internally, they were telling her not to do it. But then they went forward with this election. They thought, and the media was just like, they're just going to fucking run away with this. This is going to be the end of Corbyn's sort of rise and the left and the Labour Party. They're just going to just get decimated. And she just assumed that they would have better negotiating power for going into Brexit negotiations.
Yeah, there was before the snap election, because you had the Blairites just eating at Jeremy Corbyn, spilling information to the Guardian and all of the other presses or tabloids, and so there's constant feedback loops. He's an anti-Semite. There's all this stuff going on, but Corbyn knew that
despite
structurally,
being an anti-racist campaign
exactly.
Decades,
But Corbyn knew that the structure underneath him was strong enough that he could weather it, and he patiently weathered it out. And I think the polling was that the Tories were up by 31% or something like that, if I remember the polling. And so she's just saying, well, I can create a huge majority. They're fighting amongst themselves. This will never happen. And I can actually just destroy the Labour Party forever. I mean, since there's so much divisiveness.
I mean, this was the one and only time I will ever say and have ever said, I hope it's like with Donald Trump, because I meant at the time, Corbyn's polling quite badly, but maybe there'll be this unexpected.
Oh yeah, like leading up to it, you're like,
I hope this is going to be like with Trump, when he was polling badly and then won.
Yeah.
And it ended up being like that because the media had underrepresented how much people liked Corbyn. But I think it's like the media was as a whole, almost all of the media, apart from small left wing papers, was saying that he was unelectable and was deriding him saying he was close to the IRA and terrorists and that he was a communist, basically. Calling him Comrade Corbyn and Corbynistas and all this talk.
Yep.
And I think that what changed during the actual run-up to the election was that people actually heard what he said, because he was very little of the time were his own words being reported by the press. But suddenly he's on TV all the time giving his actual opinion. He's in debates with Theresa May. People go, oh, actually, he never formally face-to-face debated with Theresa May, by the way.
No actual debate.
No.
Because she wouldn't show up.
She wouldn't show up, right, yeah. And they say, this is actually fair. This makes sense. This is
this was something that I made note of following from afar, was that there are these mechanisms in British politics that allow for a little bit of balanced representation of those who are running to be a member of Parliament, or as I understand it, they're like when they're running, the party gets like an equal amount of time on television.
Right.
And like there's some measure of reason in the system. There's a slight measure of reason, although the press is like, I don't know out in Jupiter with the press seems out of control over there. But at least there's some little measure of reason in the system. I think it seems to be integral to the success.
I think it's specifically the BBC, right? Like it has to be balanced. But
there's a BBC law that has to give equal time to both parties, or maybe all parties. But actually, there is that in the U.S. system as well. That's partly why we saw Trump on Kimmel.
But it's not really it's not really followed to the same degree. I mean, if we looked at Bernie Sanders,
it's followed to the extent that the opponent party makes noise about it.
Yeah,
right. So the regulators may or may not enforce it depending on if they've got enough extra juice to get involved. But for example, if NBC was all Clinton all the time, the Republicans could have raised a stink and forced the FCC to intervene and give NBC Trump
you're right.
more time.
It's mostly about,
it does exist, but it's
mostly
about
less. It's mostly about the activists within the party shouting about unfairness, but not so much the FEC. I mean, the FCC and the FEC are kind of toothless. The Federal Elections Commission and the Federal Communications Commission. I
think it's more just that they've got a lot on their plate and they've got other things to do, and they're not going to get to that right away. You know, they're not going to hop on that as a violation that they're going to enforce in the kind of time frame that it would take to get it done in the campaign. You know what I mean? Like, they might get the wheels turning themselves, but like, it would take years to investigate and prove it and sanction somebody and fine them or whatever. So yeah, we do. I mean, that exists, you know, and there was the fairness doctrine in the US as well, like, which got eliminated in the 94 Telecommunications Act. But anyway, that's kind of a side note. But yeah, Corbyn's definitely, like, you know, that definitely helped him a lot because it allowed him to get exposure. And the other thing that helped him, you know, there's sort of a consensus agreement among the commentators, like the manifesto was a huge help. Once that was published, his numbers went up, and that was all costed, meaning that they had run the numbers and decided how they were going to pay for it and what it was actually going to cost. And then the Tories released their manifesto, which was not costed, which was a huge embarrassment because they had no idea how they were going to get the money for it. They couldn't answer questions when pressed.
Well, and the manifesto was so fucking embarrassing because not only was it costed, which is interesting because Sanders, his programs are also costed. So anything was paid for. There were no tax increases. So it was like beautifully levered in the middle of whatever real people are. And Thatcher had shit on because the old school part of the Tory party was just kind of left to do what they wanted because she thought it was such a sure thing. They had fox hunting in there. I'm sorry, May. Yeah, May had fox hunting in. Let's bring back let's bring back fox hunting, and let's actually have people use their houses to pay for their own health care, like their own social care for the retirees.
Yeah, for older people.
And no subsidies for like heating in the winter because old people are expendable.
They were so confident that they actually shafted, I can't think of a better word than that for it, their key demographic, which is older people, right?
Yeah.
So they took away the winter fuel allowance they were going to take away, and they were going to make it was called the dementia tax. This thing was branded the dementia tax. They were going to make people pay for their care through selling their homes if necessary.
Even child stuff too, like means testing for like subsidies for children. Like we'll just mean test the shit out of it, which is neoliberalism code word for we're taking money from you.
Right.
That's what was kind of remarkable about it, though, and I think you would see the similar thing. Like basically, you had a situation in which one party was so confident of victory that they took their mask off. Right. And they said, you know, we're going to win. Here's our absolute wish list of what we would love to do, which no one will ever say openly because everyone knows that their wish list is too ghoulish to get popular support. But they were so confident and they thought, we'll get that voted in and then we'll have a mandate to do all these things and nobody will be able to object because we'll say, that's what the people voted for. They want it. And it was so horrifying that like people were just repulsed and their numbers plummeted, you know. So it's just kind of like an object lesson in like, I think that's like another thing, sort of a bit of evidence or indication of how out of touch or insular these people are. Is that back in the day they used to know that they were screwing people and they used to know that they had to lie about that in order to make these things happen. You know what I mean? Yeah. But they're so like thoroughly inundated with their own bullshit that they actually believe that these things are good and that people will just go along with them. So they're like not afraid about saying it in public. You know
they are thoroughly inoculated by their bullshit. They're drugged by it. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's just kind of like an amazing, so it was like these sort of catastrophic errors and then on May's part, and then also, you know, refusing to debate the dementia tax, which you mentioned, they released that. There was a huge hue and cry. Then she reversed her position on it, which made her not only look like a ghoul, but like wishy-washy. And her entire campaign message was that she wasn't wishy-washy.
Strong and stable.
Strong and stable, yeah. And she just kept repeating that.
That's all she could say was strong and stable.
All she could say, and she had this kind of totally pre-scripted public performance every time she was in public, talking with a human being. She could not have a real conversation with anyone. She just was blurting out the talking points.
Yeah, whereas Corbyn was actually talking to people, and he could talk like a normal person. And
he actually enjoys it.
Yeah, and
he likes talking to people and listening to them. He's a human being. He's like, well, who are you? Where are you from? What's your deal?
And that's the irony, is because everyone says, well, he's kind of weak in Parliament because he really hates that shit. He thinks it's fake shit. But Corbyn became better, richer, more beautiful on the campaign because that's his natural environment. Is with real people.
Right. I think the other phrase that's worth bringing up that was quite funny is hard Brexit.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
As far as hard Brexit was
red, white, and blue Brexit.
Yeah, and nobody really knew what it meant, but it was, we're not going to have a soft Brexit.
It sounded like penetration with a penis.
Yeah, no, I saw a porn parody of it actually. Or I didn't actually watch it, but I saw that one was made.
Brexit.
Yeah, it was called Hard Brexit.
Right, so I'll be Googling over here.
So kind of like you didn't smoke it like Bill Clinton. You didn't really watch the porn. You just knew that it was there.
I didn't inhale. Right. No, but it was my grandfather was saying, like full English Brexit and all these kinds of jokes that were being made about it. But
the other thing we could talk about is the way that young people used meme culture. So on Facebook, Bernie Sanders had the Bernie Dank meme stash, and the millennials in Britain had the Corbyn Dank meme stash. And there was a lot of powerful meme culture that was being shared, not just with millennials, but to their family and friends.
Yeah.
And it was a powerful kind of counterforce to the billionaire class that owns the media in Britain.
My favorite meme group that I was a part of actually was called Depressed Vegetarians for Corbyn. It was very specific. He's a vegetarian, by the way. I think, he's good. But no, I think another thing that Corbyn did I wanted to bring up actually was he met up with a grime star. Yeah. So grime is like this hip hop genre of London, right? So it's like a very black genre, and this was great because this was one of his attempts to reach out not just to young people but to racial minorities, which I haven't seen any British politician do ever. But he was an anti-apartheid campaigner in the 80s. There's famous pictures of him being arrested.
Well, and once again, it feels like this Corbyn's campaign isn't built on isolation. It was borrowing some of the mechanisms from Bernie Sanders' campaign. Right. So the big breakthrough for Bernie Sanders wasn't speaking to the pastors or the black elites of the Democratic Party, which, the Black Agenda Report would talk about how John Lewis is just kind of part of this corporate neoliberal class now, like saying literally, you don't get free lunch when you get tuition. I mean, this is someone who is a civil rights hero saying no free lunch for college. And then what Bernie Sanders links up with is Killer Mike, right?
Yeah.
And Killer Mike and Run the Jewels, suddenly, bam, he has this moment where he's intersecting in a part where he doesn't usually connect with. And Bernie Sanders was real. Like, I haven't heard of this band. I don't listen to this music, but I want to work with these people, and they have the same just feelings about a better future. And the authenticity of, number one, not knowing the band and not pretending to have it on fucking his iPod like Obama. And then also saying, I've got something there.
I mean, also, I should point out that that Corbyn, Run the Jewels was the band that Corbyn opened for at Glastonbury.
Yeah, just yesterday.
Yeah. So that's he gave this 15-minute speech before Run the Jewels came on, and there was the "Oh Jeremy Corbyn" White Stripes chant going on for almost the whole time. It was great.
I think the significance of the Labour Party manifesto shouldn't be understated, though. It had a huge impact, and even though it's not really radical, there's some more rational set of ideas and proposals for the government. They're actually I think what's more interesting and more radical that they put out was their paper on alternative models of ownership, which is also on the site with the manifesto. It talks about worker cooperatives and even mentions universal basic income and things like this. But I think what was striking to me was not only that the manifesto was full of actual ideas and actual measures that would improve the lives of Britons, but it was also just fucking designed better. Like, it was actually a readable fucking document. You look at the Tory manifesto, and it's just like somebody fucking used the basic template in Word, and like, it was not only full of horrible shit, it's just like looks like shit too. Like, it's, I think the whole package, you know, you mentioned, Josh, that they also had it all costed,
right.
You know, as opposed to the Tory manifesto, which didn't. Like, it's not only reasonable, the whole thing is just like so much more appealing. It's actually like ideas that real people can relate to and can fucking read.
Yeah, I think, I mean, there's a couple of things going on there. I mean, one of them is, you know, they kind of knew, and we all saw this in the Sanders campaign, is that even though Sanders had costed his proposals, he was slandered as not having costed them anyway. They just lied about that, you know. So they knew that they were going to come after them on that ground, you know. So they knew that they had to shore up their flank on that, in that sense. But also they knew that they had that you know, this document should be accessible. It wasn't a policy document. It wasn't meant for people in think tanks and legislative aides. It was meant for, you know, the average viewer. And then the third thing that I think is like most important about that is that it stems out of like a coherent vision and value system about society, which is what enables it to become an actually coherent series of thoughts on a page. And when you know, if you don't believe in anything except, you know, or if you have to lie about what you're believing in, you know, which is essentially to enrich your friends, and you're a Tory, your policy proposals are all just a mishmash of like, you know, what your assorted friends want out of the government and what kind of set-asides and tax breaks and, you know, money funneling into their pockets they want. So it's all this kind of, it's a jumble of competing interest groups. But I think, you know, what Corbyn, and I think the significance of the entire election and like what he and his, you know, coworkers and you know, in his circle have done, and the movement has done, is like they're bringing this sort of ideology back into the politics, and in not in the sense that, you know, there's sort of some sort of doctrinaire idea about how things should work, but in the sense that they're saying, you know, politics is not about the management of the administration of the state apparatus, right? Yeah. It's not about putting a little more money in this program, a little less in that program, and moving these things around and firing these people and hiring these people. Like, politics is about a contest of competing visions of society. And like, this is our vision of what it means to live a good life and what the whole point of having a society is in the first place. Now, this is what we're about. What are you guys about? You know, and the Tories were so, I mean, and the Tories do have a vision of society, and they do have an idea.
It's a hyper individualized one. I mean, and we know going forward, we know going forward that there's just not enough resources to have a increasingly more hyper individualized future. And you look at the manifesto.
Regardless of whether or not their ideology is viable, the point is that they've gotten so used to that just being the air that they breathe, they're not even used to defending it. Like, they don't even think it's an ideology. They think it's just common sense, right? So when somebody says, well, what's your idea of the good society? And they just kind of bat their eyes and like look at you like a dog that's been shown a card trick, because they don't even know what the hell you're talking about. Because they're like, you know, well, what do you mean? We run the government and we give money to our rich friends and we go golfing. That's what politics is. What we're talking about.
Of course.
Right? So like, but it's monumental what they've done. I mean, not only that they've brought that. Politics is now a ground of contestation of what it means to be in a good society, right? That's massive. And then the other thing that they've done, which is massive, is because they hung Parliament and May has no authority anymore, they've just put a massive spanner in the gears of the entire Tory agenda. So her entire manifesto that was released during the campaign has now gone out the window. And none of these like horribly retrograde Tory policies can be enacted now. So even if he does nothing else, even if he never makes it to be prime minister, even if he retires tomorrow, like, he's already saved the country from like this just horrifying situation where like people have to sell their houses to get healthcare for. I mean, it's just craziness. So like, yeah. Anyway, I just wanted to say that.
Yeah. So well, yeah. I mean, we're looking at the future though. I think we have Theresa May for at least a year now. I think until Brexit negotiations are over. This is when she said she's going to stay until, I think after then she'll have to resign.
Has she said that?
Well, that was what she was saying as her reason for not stepping down. That we need some kind of stable government while we're doing the Brexit negotiations.
She's got to get through the hard Brexit.
Hard Brexit is.
Can you explain that? Like, how did she have? she had a Queen's Speech, but she doesn't have a deal with the DUP. Like, how does that work? Can you explain how that's...
I don't understand that.
Yeah, it's really weird, right? Does anybody...
Yeah, I can help you out. So what the agreement with the DUP and the Tories is what's called confidence in supply.
Right.
So when there's a check onto like, hey, let's have a new election because you're a majority party, right? We can do a check on you and call for an election, and DUP can hold that line, those 10 votes, right? Those 10 members of a kind of almost a KKK version of Northern Ireland. They essentially can hold that together. And so the DUP can ask for what is really needed funds for Northern Ireland because it's a very poor rural area. But also they can enact things like let's have a march in Catholic neighborhoods in Northern Ireland, and also that it might break the Good Friday Agreement. So this coalition is really hard because how do you get anything passed?
And by the way, like the threat of conflict breaking out in Northern Ireland again is really serious. There've been terrorist attacks every few years in Ireland still. People make a lot of big fuss about ISIS nowadays, but honestly, in Britain, the threat of terrorism over that issue is pretty big. Anyway.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of stuff we didn't get to too, like about the terrorist events that happened during the election cycle.
Right.
Also in how Corbyn was able to the only one to speak reasonably in response to those, and how it would normally be assumed that the conservatives, whether it's here in the States or over there, would be able to capitalize on that, and that would work in their favor, which it didn't. Mm-hmm. And since the general election, the Grenfell Tower fire and how that's a sign of this neoliberal wasteland and the austerity politics of this conservative government, and how that's also put fuel to this fire.
I think the main thing is, at least we can all agree here in this podcast, that this is a remarkable opening, right? Margaret Thatcher is the symbolic movement of neoliberalism. Corbyn is the first major national political leader to actually contest neoliberalism.
Right.
So we have an opening.
That is true.
Yeah. Any thoughts on that, Josh, before we...
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a massive thing, and I think it's a lot bigger than... the Macron victory in France, which was sort of a victory by default with like an incredibly demoralized voting populace with all-time low. A lot of the centrists are saying, well, Macron's victory proves that our method is great. And you think Corbyn's victory, well, it's not even a victory, he didn't win. But I mean, you can't really, even though he's not prime minister yet, you can't underestimate.
He's the only one acting like a prime minister,
right?
Yeah, well, there's that.
And it was the biggest. It was the biggest vote shift since 1945. So in terms of votes,
well, right? Yeah. So he actually changed the composition of the electorate, and he got people. So instead of two duopoly parties fighting over the same pie that's ever shrinking, he actually got more people to the polls. People who don't traditionally vote, young people and people of lower income. So that's huge. But then to have the fifth largest economy in the world have their major opposition party headed by a guy who's openly against neoliberalism, who's openly talking about an entirely different paradigm of politics. And the Labour Party is now the largest political party in Europe in terms of its membership.
Yeah.
About 800,000 now, right? I mean, 150, 200.
I think it's closer to 657. There were some initial...
But 500,000 before the election.
After the election, yeah.
This is a socialist party as well, right? They call themselves... he's
open
about that.
Actually socialist party, not just in name like the way the Socialist Party in France was.
No.
I mean, yeah, so you can't really... I mean, it's a really massive epical shift, and it's also completely demolished the right wing of the Labour Party in the sense that, I mean, they're still there, they're still kicking around, but they're not going to, they have to pretty much get on board with the program now or become irrelevant.
Mm-hmm. So, Aaron Bastani was mentioning this too, which is interesting on Novara Radio, is that some of them were actually, like George Carlin said, their cynics are people that were depressed idealists. And some of those people have actually said, you know what? Actually, those childhood fascinations and hopes are there, actually. I should change my mind.
Right.
I think let's wrap this up with a little, Jeremy Corbyn chants.
Oh, Jeremy Corbyn! Oh, Jeremy Corbyn! Good morning, Mr. Corbyn.
Yeah, that's the stuff. Awesome.
Thank you for giving me a few minutes. And remember, this election is about you.
I went to We're All Live, which is a music festival at Tranmere Rovers, and people started chanting. And you must know this yourselves. When you're on the stage, you can't actually hear everything that's going on in the... You know this, don't you? And then I'm looking at these guys chanting and realise they're smiling. So I paused and realised what they were chanting. I was quite moved, actually.
When are we going to hear that chant over here at like Coachella or some shit?
Oh, that'd be beautiful, wouldn't it?
I don't know. I'm trying to think. So Seven Nation Army was the reference for that melody.
Yeah.
What would be Bernie Sanders?
I don't know.
I don't know if Bernie has the same.
I want some Parliament Funkadelic. So like overdubs with "I'm going to do it in your ear hole," something like that from George
Nice.
Clinton. Yeah.
That'd be good. It's very much like the English football chant kind of chant. That is like, I think men singing in public is generally more a thing.
Well, and one of those from that clip was at, or a couple of them were at football matches.
Yeah.
They play that Seven Nation Army thing at
Right.
football matches. So that's one of the places you hear it.
So I guess it's a transatlantic love affair because we do Queen, right?
Yeah.
We will rock you, right?
Exactly. Yeah, we are the champions.
Well, hey, thanks so much for joining us.
That's a pleasure.
Alex and Josh.
I had a great time, guys. Thanks a lot for having me on.
This was a lot of fun. Time just flies when we do this stuff. So
Thanks for letting me express my excitement and just
Well,
I just feel so vindicated.
Well, we needed a native informant, so we worked really hard to get you here, and it just felt a little bit weird to have an American expat and two American guys that only tangentially have been following British politics recently.
No, it's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, so you can check us out on our website, add on to our newsletter, so thefutureismixtape.com. You can also just check us out on our Facebook page.
yeah, on Facebook, it's facebook.com/thefutureismixtape. It's at Future Mixtapes on Twitter. We will return to the Corbyn effect and the smashing of neoliberalism.
We hope to get Josh and Alex back again when we have more of a kind of understanding of at least the basis of what's happening for next year if there's going to be general elections.
Sure.
So thanks for listening. Tell other folks about this, please.
Right now, we got 7 people in Thailand listening, so it's a huge breaker for us.
Yeah, tell your friends. Thanks, everyone.